say, you running on the road, so get out the way.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the AI Cowboy. Today I want to talk about one of my favorite Python packages, which is Kedro. So as a AI engineer, I use Kedro to launch or to ship my code into production. This is a very organized, Kedro follows software engineering principles that helps you organize your data science code so you can go from notebook to production. And so in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to get started with Kedro, go over some of the main concepts of Kedro, and in the next video, we'll dive deeper into um, some of the Kedro functionality. So if you go to they have a main website, kedro.org. This project was written by some pretty smart people, and it shows by how easy the tool is. So the creators of Kedro are Quantum Black and McKinsey. And they open sourced Kedro about 5 or 6 years ago. They made it into the Linux Foundation, and so it's a very, I'd say um, it's very established Python package. Very strong community on Slack, and their GitHub is very well maintained. So I created a GitHub link that you guys can download, which has the dev container that we're working in. I'll quickly cover what a dev container is and how and why you would want to use it, and then we'll get into Kedro. So if you clone the Kedro starter repo, again, the link is in the description, you're going to see a couple different things. You're going to see a Docker file, you're going to see .dev container, and then a couple files you could ignore, like git ignore, the license, and the readme. So what we are doing is we're going to write our code in a dev container. So what that's going to do is it's going to separate my code or my when I run the code from my local operating system. So it's actually going to use this operating system versus my local Windows operating system. And so how do we do that? Well, Vscode has this extension called dev container. And so all we need to do is we need to supply a .dev container folder into the repo, and VS Code's automatically going to look at that and be like, oh, great, this user wants to write their code inside of a container. Well, the container needs to be specified by either a Docker file or a container in some sort of repository. In this case, we just have this Docker file. And so what's going to happen is, in this particular instance, we've specified this JSON logic that's going to say, open up an existing Docker file. And I'm going to give you the location of that Docker file. And we want you to use this for the container. And so to launch or build your container, you hit F1, and then you can search for dev containers, open folder and container. So let's do that. And so it's saying, okay, which folder do you want me to open this in? And it's in Kedro starter, so that's perfect. The Docker file's right in Kedro starter, which is what we expected. So we could just hit open. And it's going to launch a new VS Code. And we know that it's going to be different because we look down here and it's going to say something to the relation of dev container. Let's take a look at the log and see what it's trying to do. Okay, just running some Docker commands. Okay. And so for every project I do, I try to write it in a container. And then that way, if anybody else in the world wanted to use it, all they would need is that container to run in. They don't need to we don't need to get into the argument that it works on my machine. All right, so it should pop up here any second. All right, so you can see that we have created, I'm going to delete the space flights really quick because we're going to recreate that anyway. So we can see that this is done running because our contents in the folder are right here. And we're in the dev container, which is great. So the next thing we'll do is we're going to start with Kedro. So Kedro has a CLI that you can use. So the way it works is you just hit Kedro -H. Let's see what commands you guys have. So we have docs, info, new, and starter. Okay, so we are just going to use the starter for now, which is just basically they built a pipeline that we can test and use. It's in the documentation. So you just do Kedro new starter space flights. So we'll just go ahead and do that. So the next thing it's going to ask is, how do you want me? Can you provide a name for the folder that you want to save this in? And we're just going to name it space flights. So we should see a folder come up here called space flights. See, that's the exact name that we gave it. Cool. And so that's it. What it just did is it created all the folders and the templates we need to use to organize our code in. So typically what happens is I'll start out in a notebook. I'll write some really bad code and get it to a point where the model's good. And then once the model's good, I'll break it up into the Kedro nomenclature. So let's talk about the Kedro nomenclature. There's kind of three things that we need to pay attention to. It's the catalog, the data catalog, and the nodes and the pipelines. So what's happening is in this config folder, we have different YAML files that are essentially the options that we can use in our nodes and our pipelines. So if we take a look at the data catalog, we can see that there are different, we know that there are different inputs in here. So let's look at one of them. So we have this input this entry called companies, which is a pandas CSV data set. This type is built by, it's a class object that was built by the Kedro team. And so you'll notice that they have different types. It's called different data types in this project. So they have a CSV, Excel, Parquet, and even a pickle. That's great. The next thing we see is that this data is located in data101 raw companies.csv. So what that means is the data here is located in this data folder, 01 raw companies.csv. So this is part of the Kedro workflow where we explicitly name our data sets in this catalog. And then when we go and ship our code off, or if somebody else wants to work on our code and they are also familiar with Kedro, they'll know that the catalog.yaml file is our dictionary, our data dictionary. What's cool about this is we can actually specify a lot of logic in these YAML files. So all this pandas CSV data set is saying is, give me all the functionality of pandas strictly for their CSV functions. So pandas has a couple functions. They have the pandas, what's it called? pd.read CSV. And then they also have pandas2 CSV. And so this class object inherits those functions. And so because it inherits those functions, we can type in different load args like this, where we use the functionality from the pandas read CSV function. So in this case, we could say, hey, Kedro, when you're running the pipelines, I want you to go ahead and load this data set, but only load in the first 1,000 rows. And then alternatively, we can do save args, which is our to CSV. So in here, we can say, just provide it with, we can provide it with arguments for to CSV, which would be indexed is false. And again, the Kedro team did a lot of work because they went through all these different functions and built a class object on top of it, so that we can use this YAML file and be extremely organized. The last part I'll note about this catalog is you can even use, because one thing we'll do especially with data science work is we'll want to save our models as a pickle file so we can load these models and use them in production. And so in this case, we're totally getting away from pandas. We're actually using pickle. And in fact, they have an entire pickle data set. And so there's much more. There's a lot more data sets out there. And I think they have them on their documentation in the data catalog here. Yeah, so you can load in APIs, CSVs. You can specify S3 buckets with credentials. You can do GCS. You can also do databases, so connecting to a SQL table. So the data catalog is probably one of the most important features in here, because this is going to be telling our pipeline and our nodes where the actual where the actual data is. And now, again, so this was in our config folder right here, and then there's one more important YAML file, which is parameters. Actually, they buckled it into this parameters folder. And so what you'll see is that we have two YAML files, one for each pipeline. So this is our data science YAML file, which says, which provides scikit-learn arguments. So when we go and run our training, we can just reference this YAML file instead of digging through code and being like, what was hard-coded, what was not hard-coded. Okay, so we went through the catalog, the parameters. The next thing we're going to go through is our nodes and our pipelines. So that's located in our source. So in order to run Kedro, you need a catalog, nodes, and pipelines. So if we go into source, we can see that we have this project name called Space Flights, which is different than this name. And we have two pipelines in here. We have data processing and data science. So a pipeline has to have nodes, and nodes are just Python functions. That's easy. And so this pipeline does is going to import these functions from this nodes folder. And so then the pipeline, its job is to run these nodes either sequentially or in parallel. So in this case, we actually had an opportunity to run in parallel, because if you look at this node, it's saying, okay, I want you to run this pre-process companies. Where is this at? Again, this is in our nodes folder, pre-process companies. It takes one input, which is a pandas data frame called companies. Where is that at? It's in our config catalog YAML file, companies. And so we take in companies, we do a little bit of work to it, and then we return something new. And that something new is our output, which is pre-processed companies. And this then gets cataloged, pre-processed companies, into this folder as a Parquet file. So we went from a raw data set, ran one function in the pipeline, did some work on it, popped it into a different folder, relabeled the data frame and the type as Parquet. And so then what we're doing is we're looking at shuttles in the catalog, running some logic over it, specifically a Python function, and outputting a totally new data set. So since these two nodes are not reliant on each other, Kedro will actually run them in parallel. If you state it when you do your Kedro run CLI, and I'll show you guys how to run these in parallel as well. Now, the other pipeline we have is a data science pipeline. So again, this requires nodes from this folder, which is just a good way, just Python functions. And we can see that there's a data set called model input table, which is located in the catalog. And then there's those params model options, which is located in parameters.yaml. And so if we look at the split data node, what it's doing is it's looking at, it reads in those parameters as a dictionary. And so it's saying, okay, only give me these features, which is right here. And then it's also asking for test size and a random state from that YAML file. And then its job, this node, job is to split our model input table into training and testing. And so after it's done splitting the data, it needs to train the model. As you can see, this node is completely reliant on this node. So we cannot run these in parallel. This entire pipeline, in fact, has to be ran sequentially. And so the way we specify the runs, which pipelines get ran, is using this pipeline registry. So when we run Kedro run, right now the default is go ahead and find the pipelines and run them. It uses some backend logic to run the pipelines first through data processing, because data processing has artifacts and data sets that are reliant upon data science. So Kedro knows that it needs to run data processing before it runs data science. You can also add other, and I'll do this in another video, but you can create your own pipelines. So if you also had like an inference pipeline, you could just create, instead of running the whole pipeline end to end, you can just say Kedro run pipeline inference. So next we're gonna run our Kedro project end to end. So we'll do Kedro run. We need to first cd into space flights, which is the project. And then we're going to use the Kedro apply. And what this is going to do is it's going to run our project, both of these pipeline end to end, and you'll be able to see it in these logging options. And it even shows you where the code is being ran. So we're loading data from shuttles in the data catalog.py. It's running everything in sequential order. Even though we can specify how to run this in parallel, it should run this pipeline in parallel since there's no dependencies. And now it's just creating the model input table. And that's it. It's all done. So it went and trained our model, or it pre-processed the data, trained our model, and then output an artifact that we can then use in production. We also note that the model, it also logged our evaluation via R squared of 0.46. So what did we learn? We learned how to spawn a dev container in VS Code. We also learned the configuration of Kedro using the catalog.yaml file, the parameters. We learned nodes and pipelines. Thanks again for watching, and in the next video, we'll dive deeper into Kedro.